So thank you everyone for joining us on this afternoon for our culture chats at lunch. I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about culture chat. So good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Melissa Cole and I am the curator at the Oshawa Museum. We're happy to be participating in this series, which is a collaboration between the Ontario Regiment Museum, ourselves, the Oshawa Public Libraries, Parkwood Estate, and the Robert McLaughlin Gallery. Oshawa's galleries and libraries and archives and museums have been actively engaging the community virtually throughout the pandemic. We see this series as an opportunity to share stories with both faithful and new audiences through fun, accessible talks and programs intended to support connection and well-being. All organizations, all located in the city of Oshawa, we collectively understand and appreciate the importance of positioning ourselves on this land. You may be joining us from elsewhere, and I encourage you to visit nativeland.ca to understand the Indigenous history and languages of where we live. We acknowledge that Oshawa, the land on which we live, learn, work, and play, is located on treaty land of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Anishinaabe. Today, our Indigenous communities continue to contribute to the life of this city and celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways as sacred. Also joining me today is Laura Suchin, our Executive Director. She's just assisting with technical support as well, and possibly assisting with questions at the end of the webinar. So today's topic is Leaving Home, Finding Home, and it's about displaced persons in Oshawa. So I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. And hopefully everybody can see that. And if you can't, just leave us a comment in the chat or the Q&A. And I believe everybody should be okay to hear me. So this is a project that we started back in 2015, 2016, collecting the oral histories of displaced persons who had immigrated here to Oshawa after World War II. So sorry, my slide is just taking a minute, so. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm just going to actually turn off my screen right now, my video, just to help with my internet in case it's just giving me a little bit of issues there. So museums are often thought of as places that collect, care for, display, and interpret objects. While valid in many ways, this view omits the human element of museums. An alternative approach is to think of museums as places that collate and share human experiences. In our daily work, we must go beyond the walls of our buildings and establish lines of dialogue with our communities, deepening our relationships with them and generating authentic bonds as we serve you, our visitors and audience. Today, I will share a project about collecting the memories of those who arrived in Oshawa as displaced persons after the Second World War. I will share a bit of the background information looking into the development of our online exhibit, collecting stories from the community through oral history interviews, and I will also take a look at the creation of our latest exhibition, Leaving Home, Finding Home in Oshawa. I will first provide you with a bit of background about our project, and then I'll share a few stories and talk about the exhibit, which is now on display at the museum in Lakeview Park. This exhibit was created with my co-curator, Mia Yutchuk. Unfortunately, she cannot be here today to present with me due to prior commitments. Mia joined us on the project quite early on in 2018. We're about 2 years into the project, and I'll talk a bit more about what her role was as well. So I spoke with our archivist, Jennifer Waymark, about how this project got started. And it came about in late 2015, 2016. And just to quote Jennifer, I watched Canada launch Operation Syrian Refugees. Arriving here were people whose country had been ravaged by war, people who had lost everything and were coming to Canada in search of a safe place to start over. Hearing these stories reminded me of stories I knew about many Oshawa residents who had arrived here as displaced persons after World War II and who had left their country ravaged and then without a home. After World War II, Canada was a place to start over for many who had lost everything during the war. Oshawa itself had become home to a large number of displaced persons from all across Eastern Europe. Their stories, their experiences helped shape the Oshawa that we live in today. We felt it was important to learn more about their experiences and to see if they were different from the experiences of a new group of people coming to Canada, each in search of safety and a new life. The museum started another memory book project to collect the stories of individuals who arrived in Oshawa as displaced persons. The museum reached out to various community partners and organizations in Oshawa to assist us in distributing information about the project to their members. Groups such as the Senior Center, various cultural communities such as Ukrainian and Polish communities invited us into their halls to share about our project with their communities. This project was, we had a lot of support through Young Canada Works grants, who provided us the ability to hire students who assisted us with creating the memory books themselves, and also with collecting oral histories. So after the Second World War, the term displaced persons referred to individuals who had become displaced due to conflict. Over 157,000 displaced people came to Canada, marking one of the most significant periods of immigration in the country's history. The aftermath of World War II saw a world faced with mass movement of human beings on a scale never before seen. Initially, the idea was to repatriate people back to the countries from where they had been displaced. It soon became clear that this was not going to be possible. When the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration concluded its work, there were still well over 1.1 million displaced persons who were determined to be non-repatriatable. The job of finding homes for these people was handed over to the newly created International Refugee Organization. The IRO was tasked with finding homes for approximately 875,000 people. This particular image here shows Hildegard Suchin and Detlef Dave Suchin. This photo was taken on March 1952. They had arrived in Halifax in March 1952 on the Neptunia. And this particular image was donated actually was loaned to us by one of our staff members, Laura Suchin, who is actually the executive director of the Oshawa Museum. So in 1947, the Canadian government agreed to open the borders for 5,000 displaced persons to come to Canada and begin life anew. The ads that you can see here in this slide are from the Times-Gazette newspaper in Oshawa, and they're ranging in dates from 1946 into 1948. And just see some of the headlines there that you'd be seeing in the newspapers at the time. Oshawa had become an enticing place for relocation for many Ukrainians escaping Europe after World War II, due in large part to the already large Ukrainian community in the city. Immigration to Oshawa by Ukrainians began around 1907 when a gentleman by the name of Julian Kalinko had moved here. His arrival was the start of a growing community of Ukrainian immigrants in the south end of Oshawa. The southern border of the city at this time would have been Bloor Street. The area south of Bloor Street and Simcoe Street South was known as Cedardale at the time. And this particular area of just outside of Oshawa at the time was not annexed with the town of Oshawa until about 1924. So approximately 2 to 3 million Ukrainians found themselves as displaced persons post-World War II. In 1946, the Oshawa branch of the Canadian Ukrainian Committee spoke to the community about several resolutions put forth by the committee to bring Ukrainian displaced persons to Canada. Upon arriving in Oshawa, Ukrainians found themselves in an area that very much felt like home. There were several Ukrainian churches, community halls such as Ukrainian National Hall, and a small retail sector of businesses owned by Ukrainians. There was also readily available jobs in the manufacturing sector. Fittings Limited, a company that manufactured pipe fittings, waterworks, fittings, and plumbing brass goods, had a workforce comprised of a great deal of immigrants in this area. So another group of displaced persons that arrived in Oshawa shortly after the war were from Poland. Similar to the Ukrainian community, there was already an established Polish community in Oshawa prior to the Second World War. The Polish community settled around the Olive Street area and established business and organizations to serve members of their community. Many worked at the numerous industries that were already operating in Oshawa. Perhaps the largest concentration of workers could be found around the area of Ontario Malleable Ironworks. Their works was located close to the neighborhood around Olive Avenue. And you can see here on this 1948 fire insurance map. I love these maps. They really provide great details of the community at the time. There in the center, you can see the large factory, Ontario Malleable Iron. And just north of that, you can see the Olive Avenue. You can see the row houses there. And you can see other smaller clusters of neighborhoods as well that had developed in the area. You can see the small communities developing. While Ukrainian and Polish immigrants made the largest percentage of displaced persons to settle in Oshawa, immigrants also arrived in Canada from countries such as Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, just to name a few. So the Oshawa Museum is grateful to everyone who participated in our project and who has trusted us to archive and share their stories. This here outlines the individuals who participated in our project. Many individuals, their memories were shared by those in our family, as you can see as well. And I'm going to share a few of these stories as well through the rest of the presentation. So this actual project, usually with exhibits and online exhibits, quite often an online exhibit happens after our actual physical exhibit. But this project actually started out as an online exhibition. And this slide here is actually showing us the first part of this exhibit, and it was actually designed by Mia, who I had talked about earlier. She was a co-curator of the exhibit, the in-person exhibit at the museum, and she designed this exhibit. The online exhibit, Oshawa Post-World War, saw the resettling of this place, and this is a screenshot of it on this slide. It drew on the memory book, the stories that were shared through the memory book and the interviews, and it was organized into 12 sub-themes, such as working life, drawing, and we tried to draw on similarities that were being found across the various experiences. So we looked at the donated materials and the oral histories, and that directly guided our supplementary historical research. Which helped to fill any contextual gaps. For example, looking at expectations and first impressions, highlights, quotes expressing how displaced persons felt upon first arriving to Canada. We noticed a major trend was to comment on the sense of uncertainty, balanced with that burgeoning sense of safety. Another frequent trend was to comment on the natural landscape or the weather, which is often much colder than expected. For example, Bill Dronsky, who immigrated from Poland, remarked the following: "We were taken aback by the expansive wilderness of Canada. We had departed from a city in Northern Ontario was an eye-opener. On the other hand, the entry across the Atlantic highlights materials such as family photographs or letters indicating who and what individuals had to leave behind in order to move to Canada. This sparks reflection on the journey of immigrating and what few items people were able to carry with them." So Mia was instrumental in assisting me with the overall design of the exhibition. And we're going to talk a little bit about that through this slide here. So in designing both the online and on-site exhibition, inspiration came from the very colorful identity and travel documents that the oral history project participants had donated to the Oshawa Museum's archives. So on this slide here, you can see two IDs, which really stood out actually to both of us when we were looking through the material. The vibrant use of the colors purple and green. You can see also the header of a text panel for the actual physical exhibit in the top corner there, which takes inspiration from the same color theme. In the first document, you can see now is a temporary travel document in lieu of a passport for stateless persons, and the persons of undetermined nationality, which was used by Xenia Kolodjkowskis. So the document is trilingual with information written in English, French, and German. It also has information about the 3 Allied armies, which would have controlled the displaced person camps and had been stationed around Germany at the time. So that is the French, British, and American armies. The other document, which you can see, the top of here, is a citizen document that had been issued to Xenia. When discussing early memories of Oshawa, some of the project's participants commented on was how they felt when first becoming Canadian citizens, including the Kolodjkowskis in 1957. This document coincidentally also makes use of the vibrant purple and green colors in addition to red, as well as forming the beautiful border around the citizenship information, as you can see. So in comparing these two documents, the circular nature of the story that we're telling really struck us. That's when the displaced persons were forced to leave with anonymous passports quoting statelessness. They would eventually receive a much more personalized Canadian document such as this one, which they could then remember fondly when recalling their stories. The same notion of circularity eventually led to the name of the in-person exhibit as well. And that's the portion of leaving home, finding home in Oshawa, and it served to inspire the layout and other design elements of the exhibition. So to provide a little bit more background, in the early 20th century, Canada's immigration policy was one of exclusion after World War II. There was an overall sympathy toward displaced persons of war-torn Europe. However, with the base in Canadian Parliament and the support from local and cultural community organizations such as those in Oshawa, the doors to Canada did eventually open once arrangements had been made to immigrate and travel to Canada. The long and uncomfortable journey by ship would begin. The image that you see on this slide is the Skyethia, a Cunard Starline ship. It traveled from Europe, from ports in Germany or Italy to Nova Scotia, and were docked at Halifax's newly landed immigrants could go through customs and processing at Pier 21, which is today the Canadian Museum of Immigration. This postcard was donated to the Oshawa Museum by one of our participants. So despite the easing of immigration restrictions, for some time immediately after World War II, the separation of parents from their children or spouses from one another often still occurred. In some cases, the reality of war made reunion impossible. However, often the most uncertain times did eventually lead to happiness with family reunification in Canada. This would often take several years, as a Canadian immigration policy did not facilitate families traveling together for many decades, even after the war had ended. In these times, family members, including children, had quite varied experiences of the post-war immigration journey. If they're too young to fully understand what was happening, as were a few participants in the Oral History Project, they may have actually enjoyed the novelty of, running around the ship, playing with other kids their age. Some participants have even commented on the requirements around immigration were strict at this time, favoring able-bodied young men willing to sign a labor contract with a particular company. The most frequent industries for such contracts were farming, mining, or forestry, and the labor contracts often lasted around 2 years. So here is an image of one of our participants, Steve Malish, who was a Ukrainian displaced person, and he had worked at Brompton Pulp and Paper, which was a lumber company in Northern Ontario here. You can see a photo of him at work, and you can also see his identification card indicating that he had arrived in the port of Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1947 and began working in Beardmore, Ontario shortly after. If you look closely, the bottom of the card also notes what to do in case of a serious accident. And the back of the ID similarly encourages the cardholder to to preach and practice safety first, and to be careful of fire. So as I had mentioned earlier in our presentation, the key to this exhibit and the work that the museum does is to share stories of people. So placing these two items together in conversation with one another, to me, indicates the importance of doing this. It's also important to read between the lines of text and try to imagine the lives of the people impacted as well. So in this particular case, it brings to light the danger of the harsh working conditions and the sacrifices that were made by displaced persons to make a life in Canada. Additionally, this card had some useful information such as conversion rates and how to become a Canadian citizen. Steve Malish and many other displaced persons did not speak English very well, or at all when they first came to Canada, until they had a chance to learn very quickly while on the job. So in that sense, this particular information on these cards would not have been that useful for quite some time. Similarly, many displaced persons who worked in other industries commented on the poor quality of life and their desire to move on to something safer as soon as possible, as dictated by the length of their labor contracts. For example, one participant, Jan, he had pointed out some of the differences between Oshawa and Kirkland Lake, where he had worked, saying he felt that it was like day and night. He explained that he finally felt safe after the destruction of Poland and Germany and working in the mine. When he was able to move to Oshawa due to this, he said that it had felt like the beginning of his life when he was able to make that move. However, work in Oshawa was not always the safest either. Unfortunately, other than seasonally based industries such as construction and farming, it was usually much more stable. At the very least, the jobs that were available for recent immigrants to Oshawa at this time included factories, fittings, PJ Gale and Lumber was mentioned, Hudai, Malleable Iron Works, Peddler People, and Robson Leather. These were many of the industries that provided jobs. And for him, eventually, many wanted to work in General Motors, as it was said to have been better conditions, better pay. However, that was usually only possible after having been in Canada for quite a few years. And for many of these positions, it generally helped to have a friend or an acquaintance from one's community who was able to put in a good word. For example, the following quote describes how Steve Malish decided to move to Oshawa. It says, "While working for the Brompton Pulp and Paper, many of us heard that there is a large Ukrainian community in Oshawa. A group of friends and I decided to come and see if we could find work and a place to live. So while the Polish and Ukrainian communities are perhaps the most well-known in Oshawa, many others were also renewed or bolstered by post-war immigration. And these included the Italian, German, Hungarian, Serbian, Slovenian, Maltese, and Greek communities, as well as others. And although the landscape of Oshawa has changed a lot in the last 70 or so years, many active churches and community halls and clubs can still be found, some of which are still on their original locations. And each year, many of these community halls open their doors to the annual Fiesta Week Festival. And unfortunately, due to COVID, that has not happened in the last 2 years, but fingers crossed, we hope to see that return soon. So I'd like to talk a bit more about the research process for the exhibit. The story I'm going to share now is actually a story that Mia shared with me and I wanted to share with you today. And it involves the Ukrainian church images here. And I'll just share a bit of Mia's story. So she found that looking very closely at the buildings and neighborhoods, that they found themselves, they proved to be quite useful going through and seeing all the various buildings. So for instance, while researching, Mia had never realized that the Slovak community had quite a large presence in Oshawa until one day while driving home from work, she had noticed the Slovak church, which is on Ritson Road. Taking note of its Byzantine-inspired architecture and later looking it up to see that she had found out after some research, it turned out the Slovak community had been in Oshawa since at least the 1920s. As one Oshawa Reformer article from 1968 indicated that the community had celebrated their 40th anniversary. This article also mentioned the different community centers, the Slovak Leave branch, the Catholic Slovak Union branch, and a Slovak National Hall. Although these buildings are no longer around, the presence of the church was able to indicate that the community itself was worth looking into more. And we're glad that we're able to find out more about it as well, as we did, as similarly, one of the favorite moments of the research process was coming to an understanding of the connection between the different Ukrainian churches in Oshawa, which I had one point numbered to be around 6 in total, we believe. It included 2 on the very same block. The intrigue or confusion did not stop there, as some of the sources she had been consulting called one of the churches a different name. So that's the church that you can see on the slide here. So the different names were Greek Russian, Ukrainian Orthodox. As we later realized, this was in part due to a translation issue, but the church in question is the church on Bloor Street East, and it also had its entry in the 1926 Vernon Street directory, which you can see. And together, looking at the images as well as just the church, the way it stands today, as you can see on the right, was able to help us determine its history. So focusing on this one church was able to provide us a window into the past, which was that the church had changed ownership from Ukrainian to Greek, and most recently to Romanian. This also provides insight into the immigration trends that were happening in Oshawa. It also shows what was happening more recently in the post-war period as well. And on this final slide, you'll see an image of Simcoe Street in the late or early 1940s, just before the time that many displaced persons would begin to make Oshawa their home. As Steve Malish recollections describe, everything he needed was within walking distance, and he could have his pick of Ukrainian community centers that he wanted to participate in, like many of the other staff. At the museum, we've all had some personal stories connected to this, especially those of us that have resided in the area as well. Probably one of the biggest takeaways from working on this project, after giving this presentation, I've been asked this question before, and it's, for me, I've grown up in Oshawa as well. So really learning the history of the city, about where I grew up, where I'm from, has allowed me to also see the landscape in different ways. Driving around the areas as I've listened to some of the oral histories, imagining the spaces, seeing how the landscapes changed over the years as well. And also reading between the lines of text, making connections with photographs and stories to help bring this story to life as well. It's really enjoyable to be able to listen and collect oral histories. It's important to share the story of the people that are living in our community today. So I hope that when you're able to visit the exhibit in person, that you feel the same sense of seeing Oshawa a little differently as it was in the post-war decades, and how that period has really helped shape the Oshawa that we live in today. So I thank you very much. And if you do have any questions, I would be happy to take them. If you have any questions, you can put them into the chat. If not, I'll wait another couple minutes if there's no more questions or anything. If you are interested in seeing this exhibit, it is on display right now at the Oshawa Museum. You can pre-book a tour time by visiting our website. We are also open for casual visitors. You can visit us by coming into Guy House as well, the yellow building. But I do definitely recommend pre-booking a tour time, so then you have that slot dedicated to you. So I do want to thank everybody for joining me today, and I invite you to join us every Friday at noon. Book it into your calendar, and please visit the RMG website or any of our websites, the Oshawa Public Library. Oh, I do see a comment here. I just want to share it before. My grandparents came from Slovakia, and so this is shared by one of our participants. My grandparents came from Slovakia in 1935 and settled right across the street from church on Bloor Street. So I'm sure some of the stories, thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. I'm sure some of the stories that I was sharing today might have connected to your family story as well. Thank you for sharing. So our guest speaker next week is going to be the curator from the RMG, Sonia Jones, and believe she'll be talking about their latest permanent exhibition. So on a lovely Friday, I see another question. When is the exhibit open? The exhibit is open right now, and it was actually supposed to open in 2020. So we recommend you come on down. I just see Lisa has put that in the comment there. Thanks, Lisa. It's going to be on display for quite some time. We had quite a few people that participated in the project. Normally our exhibits are up for a year, but we're actually going to keep it up until the end of 2022. We also have the online exhibit as well that will remain on. And we're looking at creating a virtual tour of that space as well, just to open it up and provide access to even more people. So yes, definitely bring your dad down. We're always interested in collecting and hearing more stories as well. So we would love to visit Jennifer. So definitely come on down. You can even email me if you want to schedule a visit at curator@oshawamuseum.org as well to arrange a time. So again, thank you, everyone. I do want to wish everybody a wonderful weekend and take care and have a great weekend. Goodbye, everybody.